Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Death. It happens to all of us, eventually. Every family must deal with the crossing of a loved one. How do we steward our beloved through death, dying, and beyond? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, www.vocbn.ca. With us this hour to explore supporting the death process is Nancy MacMillan. Nancy is a registered psychotherapist, a former certified spiritual health practitioner who has worked in acute care, palliative care, and long-term care. She's now in private practice. Nancy holds a degree in economics from Carleton University, followed by graduate work in adult education at the University of Toronto. She did further graduate work at Queen's University in Theology, specializing in spiritual care and a Pluralistic Society. Taking advanced clinical units in CPE, she became a Certified Spiritual Health Practitioner under CASC. Nancy is the author of Call to the Far Shore, Carrying Our Loved Ones Through Dying, Death, and Beyond. Her website, nancymacmillan.substack.com. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
For having me.
It's just wonderful to have you. And this is such an important topic in these days. It seems like all the practices that we used to have and customs around dying have kind of gone by the wayside, and it leaves us floundering.
That's right. And, it's been part of my sense that, we all come from a people who knew how to do this. Our heritages are rich with knowing how to include death, dying, and our dead. And we need to come back and learn from them and bring it forward again to help us through this time when fear seems to predominate so much the death process.
It really does. So your bio states you are a certified spiritual health practitioner. What's that?
Okay. It's the new term used for what we used to call multi-faith chaplains. And so in the hospital, there's chaplaincy that has always been part of a hospital system because of wanting to ensure that the level of training, they adopted the term spiritual health provider that was more pluralistic and had a guaranteed sense of the amount of training that goes into this. So there's a great deal of training, and eventually we all became psychotherapists as part of it as well. So as well as the very intense personal training and spiritual care development and theology training, we also are registered psychotherapists.
That sounds like it was pretty doggone demanding, right?
It sure was, yeah.
Yeah, they kind of upped the bar a little bit.
That's true. And so many people don't realize that. And so many hospitals have spiritual care practitioners, and it's a tremendous resource if you are in the hospital and looking for some support, emotional, spiritual, or advocacy, or just a listening ear. You don't have to be religious. You just a human being who has a need, and we're available for all that.
It's too bad there weren't more of you around during COVID. I know so many people were left alone during their last hours, and they probably kept you guys totally out of the house, out of the hospital, and away from the people.
Well, no, we're definitely part of the medical staff, so we were part of that system. I was not there at that time, but certainly all my colleagues were.
Oh, goodness. Well, bless you for doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
What brought you to work with the sick and dying in the first place?
Well, I've had a long life of having death and dying be part of my life. From my own personal experiences facing illness and cancer diagnosis at a fairly young age.
Mm-hmm.
And then being with my parents, both with them when they died, it brought me into lean into death rather than away from it. And that took me into how can I use my experience and my interest, and that took me into the profession, and then working for years with the very ill and the dying at their bedside. So that gave me a lot of experience being up close to what dying looks like, and that gave me a different picture than what many of us have. It can be more peaceful than we think. And I'm trying to help people understand that the fear that we have of it is sometimes because we have become isolated from what death looks like and removed from it. And that's been generations now since we've had been more removed from it, when professionals or a system has taken over the care. So it's hard to get up close and to see real death and dying, and that makes us fearful. But from my experience, dying can be a natural and safe and a peaceful experience. And palliative care has come so far now that pain should not be a reason to be fearful at the end of life. There's many reasons why we fear death. It's a natural process that we all have to work through. But pain is not one of the issues that should be uppermost in a person's mind. And for the other reasons that we have fear and the discomfort and pain and suffering, well, let us, our loved ones, be present and learn how to be a calm presence at the end we can lend our stable mind and our heart to be a presence that can help that process unfold in a peaceful way.
Yeah, it's hugely important because it's not just the dying that are going through it, it's the families as well. In your education, did you learn how to work with the entire unit
Oh, of
through the
course, yeah.
time?
Yes, for sure. It's a family system that we're with. So being at the bedside of the person who's ill and dying, but also with their family and loved ones, helping everybody learn what death looks like and how we can be helpful at the end stages. I had many people who are nervous at seeing what death can look like, the shallow breathing, the death rattle, the changes in color, pallor. All of it can be very dramatic looking and sounding. And so we fear the worst, that our loved ones are suffering, and we ring the call bell to ask for help. And it's an emergency, and we want to give more medication. So it was really important for there to be some people there to say, look, the death rattle sounds dramatic, but what it is just that the throat is closing, and your loved one is so far away from actual feeling at this point that they are not suffering from this. So that just helps a person release that tight grip that you have of anxiety that your loved one is suffering, if they know a little bit about the natural process of our bodies and how we let go at the end.
Hugely important. So, what are your perspectives on death, dying, and how do they differ from the mainstream view?
Well, being a spiritual health practitioner in my profession gave me the the role that I could say, so what are your thoughts of what happens next? Or, what is it that gives you strength to get through this time? So that enabled a conversation to take place that went beyond, the moment of the suffering. And we would have beautiful conversations often, or we'd at least be wondering. And that sense of wondering and expanding our sense of imagination of what lies beyond that final breath can expand ourselves so that we're a little more prepared, because so much is happening at that last moment. And from my experience and from my own studies and my own spiritual sense, um, if we can approach our last breath with more consciousness, perhaps we can take that next step into the next journey with more consciousness and perhaps even joy. And that's been what I've been trying to help people see, that there's that possibility that it's not just a tragedy at the end. it can be a release, and it can be a homecoming into a joyful place.
And that's hugely important because, we welcome birth and it's a very similar process, really, isn't it?
That's right. We incarnate and we trust the birthing process. So, can we come back to trust the death process? And, you know, the hope is, of course, that we can find ourselves in the full cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, even.
From a personal standpoint, do you believe in rebirth? Do you believe in coming
Mhm.
back?
Well, it's been my sense that it just has a sense of it makes sense to me that we're such marvelous creatures. We're part of creation, that there is something that continues and goes on. And from all my reading and from my sense, it makes sense that there is something that can return. How will we ever know? But I like to live my life with the thought that that is a possibility. And if that is a possibility, then how do I live my life now to to make sense of that?
To embrace that. So we've stepped away from a lot of our traditions, and as we go on with the show here today, I'd like to get more into that. But the traditional every society, of course, had their own traditions on how they dealt with death, dying, and beyond. Um, but we've really lost that. What do you see the impact of that on the people that are getting ready to cross or their families?
That's right. Well, number one is fear. So that it means that when we come to our end times, we often want to be medicated to the point where our consciousness is sometimes not very present. Now, sometimes that is important for pain relief, but there can be a fine balance there. Like, how much can we take of pain medication, but also be awake and aware? And also trust that if many people, and this is my experience with my mom, was able to get to the end of her life and be in the dying time, and she didn't need pain medication. That is a very likely possibility that we don't need it, but our medical system has been trained to do that as a matter of course. So I
Error
had
on the
to
side of caution, right?
I had to negotiate that I don't see my mom suffering. I'm looking really carefully. What I do, I see her dying, and there is a difference there. And so my mom was able to die at age 97
Wow.
without pain medication, and she had the most joyous countenance when she did finally leave.
Oh, there's a lot to be said for being able to be present with the process, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that is what we're called upon today, is to consider where our consciousness is during our whole life, and how we can build up our muscles to be able to be as conscious as we can as we approach our end times, and imagine being conscious at the very end and what that means for this next step afterwards.
Mm. Well, it's time for us to take a station break. Nancy and I will return very shortly, so please don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. What is the job description of helping the dying to cross? With
Mm.
us this hour discussing stewarding the dying is Nancy MacMillan, the author of Call to the Far Shore, Carrying Our Loved Ones Through Dying, Death, and Beyond. Her website, nancymcmullen.substack.com. Nancy, do you consider yourself a death doula?
I am not trained as a death doula. No, there is a distinct profession, or informal profession in some cases, to be a death care guide. I had the wonderful opportunity to perform the work of a death doula, in that I brought my mom's body home when she died from the nursing home to my home. And so we were able to wash and prepare my mother's body and have her in our parlor, our spare bedroom, for 3 days. And I had a small group of friends a death care guide who was one of them who, helped that process unfold. Um, and and these people are available now in most places. So if you have any instinct to really lean into death and participate in it, the big surprise is what it can offer you in terms of moving through grief, finding ways to be in a ritual way with your loved one that can emerge spontaneously, be in a community of people who are in the most, a deepest place of being together. And you get to say goodbye over a few days and not abruptly all at once. And all those things help not just the people who are saying goodbye, but it's become to be my belief that it helps the person who's actually died to release themselves in a more gradual, peaceful way.
Well, I know the custom of sitting with the dead
Uh-huh.
for 2 to 3 days. I mean, it's still present in the Tibetan systems, and um, so I know it's fairly common with different cultures. What's the purpose? I understand that the person might leave the body, but the body has some dying to do. There's all sorts of
Mhm.
flora and fauna and living things with the body, even after the spirit leaves it. Does that have is that honoring that, or what is the
Wow,
purpose of the
that's a
wake?
that's a wonderful perspective. Now, in the Celtic tradition, which some of us are from, myself included, the 3-day wake, to go back and understand what that was for. Um, uh, we've kind of lost the thread of what that was for, and so I think it's easier for us to forget to do it or not bother with it. But there was a big part of community coming together and supporting each other. But there was also the tendril that we were helping that person know they were dead and gradually leave with all the support of the community around them, and with this phenomena that we've lost track of as well, which is called keening, which is that full-bodied expression of our grief that can be really let loose when we're with people who are free in their body and souls to do that. And it's been my experience that doing that just creates a channel. It's like a clear river can run through us and give us the energy to go the next step. For us as the bereaved, but also for the person who has died. Indigenous cultures, around the world, you hear them understand that it is our full-bodied grieving and tears that give the departed one the energy and the resources to keep going on their journey. And that's a long forgotten piece of the whole puzzle.
It certainly seems to be, but there's, from the traditions that I've studied, there's a lot of wisdom in it. How do you see our people suffering, the survivors,
Mhm, mhm.
as a result of not having that full body experience at the death of a loved one?
Right. Well, what we see, and I certainly see in my practice, is a lot of grief that hasn't really found its way to be mobilized and to find a way to be a transformative force for each of us. There's no way around grief but going through it. And that does mean sometimes crawling through a deep tunnel. But what we can be assured is that there is movement that can guide us further on. But if we don't have a fuller body expression, and often that best happens or most easily happens right in the immediacy of a great loss of a death, that we can be in touch with that. And if we kind of miss that moment, which is so common these days because we postpone our ceremonies, our rituals, and so we're postponing everything, and then we've missed a moment, and it's much harder to come back to that original feeling of being ripped open and letting that howl of despair out. And if we don't, then that howl gets kind of hidden in the basement of our lives and comes out often in a sense of numbness and and uncertainty on how to keep going.
Also, we all have baggage around different people in our lives, particularly loved ones. Um, does the process of being able to deeply grieve like that right up front also help us to forgive and let go?
Mm. That's a big question, and I think you're hitting on that thing, that our immediacy of letting our full emotions out. Our grief will hold all kinds of feelings, our loss, but also the grief of perhaps a relationship that wasn't completed or that had unfinished business. So we'll have a great deal with it. But I think in that immediacy, it can all come up and out, and it gets liberated to some degree. The whole process of forgiveness, it's a mysterious process, how we do that. But by becoming as conscious as we can of the hurts, of the wounds, and of the reality of the other person, that they were a full person themselves, that they may have done harm, but that wasn't their only role in life, that they had a full life beyond the harm that we may have been exposed to. So it takes a degree of consciousness and maturity to allow that person the fullness of who they are, and to let them be that, and to let them go, and to know that on the other side, they are not the same as they were here. And how can we let that go is a process. But from what I can feel and from my experience, they want to make amends. And I think we can let them make amends by giving them a seat at our table still, as hard as that might be. But it's an easier way than by abandoning them to the periphery, where unconsciously things can still take place.
Now, by a seat at your table, do you mean literally the custom of setting a place for the dead?
Ah, that's right. That is a literal imagination, but it's a bit metaphorical as well. So, how that will act for look for each person, will be different. But that's a good question. How can I make a seat at the table for my loved one? Maybe it's through having pictures up. Maybe it's through writing notes to them. If you have a fraught relationship, then perhaps writing a letter and expressing it that way will help liberate some of those feelings, so that you can move to the next step. There's many ways to do it. And then there's the deeper way of sitting in stillness and quiet and calling that person forth just by saying their name from your heart, and allowing the presence of that person to be present with you, and to speak how you would like to speak with them in those quiet moments.
I know that I studied with a Lakota elder among many others, and when he was teaching me about dying, he said that in his tribe's case, the pipe carrier's job was to hold the spirit of the dead for a full year, and that gave the
Mm,
people time to mourn. But then at the end of that year, he would, psychopump or help the dead to cross, but then the family was not to mention the person's name again. They could say, "He who was my brother's son," or
interesting.
something like that, but
Mhm.
not the name. Do you feel that, the dead can be stuck here or called back if we don't let go in a formal way?
Right. Yes, that we're getting more into the nuance of this. There's that one part of keeping a connection, but what are we keeping a connection with? We're not keeping a connection with the story of the person, but if we can imagine that their spirit is traveling on, and that we're well wishing them on that journey, we're not calling them back. And our mourning and our grief has a season, but it is not forever. And the importance of then moving into a healing place to keep a rhythm of life going into some normalcy again is the season of grieving, mourning, and living. And to be part of that helps us keep moving, and it gives the right place for our loved ones, for them to find the right place. Because yeah, we don't understand that part of those who've gone and who linger. That's and it's not something I fully understand, but we have to give a space to not mess around with that too much. But if we hang on to our mourning and grief for so long, we may be holding them back. And if we don't do any grieving, if we don't have any rituals to honor them going on, that's not helping them keep moving either. So there's a lot to learn, but we can all start somewhere to find our little step in that process.
What would you have to tell our audience if they find they're having a lot of trouble letting go of someone that's crossed? What advice would you give them?
Right. Hmm. Well, we all need the imagination that they need to have their place, and that they can and want to move on, and they want us to move on, and that moving on doesn't mean forgetting. And some people feel that if they move on, it's not honoring them, and it's forgetful. But there are ways that we can be more nuanced and let go and keep the connection that will always remain, which is through our heart and love. And the life force and the love force that comes through our beloved dead and our ancestors comes from behind and wants to move us forward into life. And they need us to do that so that they can still participate in life in the way they do from where they are now.
Do you feel that the formal process helps people every time, or do you feel like some people that are having a little more trouble need to look deeper into maybe guilt or non-forgiveness?
Well, for sure. That's where support can help to unfold the process that might be hanging back there. Because, we can do our best work before a person dies. There's so much that happens as we're dying that really loosens our old defenses and our old way of seeing things. So the more we can be doing the work before a person dies, the better. We can be more conscious and together start working things through. And even if we can't work things through, but even being able to say to an elderly uncle or father or aunt, this is what hurt me,
Well,
and
I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry.
I'm sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt, Nancy, but it's time for another station
Okay,
break.
sure.
Nancy and I will be right back to continue our discussion. Please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. Do we really understand dying? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the death process is Nancy MacMillan. Her website, nancymacmillan.substack.com. Nancy, it seems like we have kind of lost, again, because we're not exposed to it. Used to be people would die at home more than in the hospital, and we'd watch our grandparents and maybe our great grandparents go through the process. And are there certain steps that are pretty common that we can kind of expect? And if so, would you mind sharing?
Um, so the steps in the death process.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, we see birth. Okay, the mother starts labor, and then the
Mhm.
labor gets more intense, and we know what to expect pretty much, and
Right.
we know when it slides from the norm. But
Mhm.
death, people are kind of, as far as I can see, unaware of the different steps,
That's
stages.
right. Right. Well, the problem that we're most able to observe, of course, is an irresistible sleepiness. That we get tired, and more of our day will be spent sleeping, and that's a gift because it's doing the work of letting go and restoring our life forces for what still needs to go on. But over time, our body knows naturally how to gently break down our life forces and let go. And that will be changes in breathing, changes in our consciousness, changes in our temperature and our pulse, our heart rate, the mottling of our skin. So there's all stages. And if you're upfront to that process. You'll get to observe them, and hopefully you'll be able to be a loving observance of it and not fearful. And if you are fearful, then ask for support from those who know what natural death looks like.
And there's another thing that's always fascinated me, and I've experienced it firsthand with my dying relatives, is seeing people from the other side, starting to see them
Yeah,
in the room, starting to,
right.
what do you think that's all about?
Right. Well, isn't that wonderful? It gives us a little sense that we're thinning the veil there at the end, and and the people who are on this side are becoming, are starting to recede. Our role is receding, and the role of those who are on the other side are starting to take precedence to help that transition over. That's the imagination I have, and that's the observation I have from being at the bedside of a number of people. How often the words will be like, oh, I'm going home, or my train is coming, or get me my keys for I have to get into the car to get on my journey. Um, for my mom, I remember her saying at the day before, it's like, look, the sun has just come out. And of course, it was a dark room, and the sun was far from view. But in her imagination and her reality, there was another process happening that she was readying for. And if we can have that imagination, that um, to be able to reach out our hand for the hand that will reach ours from the other side, because we have many loved ones who will be assisting that transition. I think we can make that transition easier.
And it's interesting how some of these things are fairly universal. Like you
Mhm.
mentioned, the days ahead of time, going, "Oh, I'm going to go on a trip."
Right.
I need my keys. I need to pack my suitcase. That
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Um, are there other things like that that you can kind of tell when a person experiences them? You go, "Oh, we're getting kind of close to the gate."
Hmm. Um, well, there's a sense I've noticed in many people that they become more beautiful in a unique way. That the continents that might have been more clouded and working through difficult stuff, the very last few days there's a translucence to the skin that starts appearing. It's like a light is starting to shine from behind them, and so trust that. Yeah.
The When we know we're getting close, when we know that our loved one's getting close, what are the signs there? Is it
Mhm.
something in the breathing? What are the signs there?
Um, well, the breathing definitely changes, and that's unmistakable to know that there will be, gasps in the breathing. And one of my first experiences was with my father when he was dying, and I was quite young. So seeing the changes in his breathing was at first quite alarming. And as we all may know, that there become a gasp, and then there be no breath. And most people think, okay, that's the end. Well, I got to my father's side, and he took another gasp. Well, so that started a chain reaction of just staggered breathing. And then there was the moment where I was leaning close thinking this was it. And the words came, "You're too close." This is not for you. This was, to me, was the angel of death. It was
Mm.
telling me to back off a little bit. Because as much as we want to help our loved one, there's a moment when we also have to let them take their next step, and that we have to step back because we can only walk so far with them. Otherwise, I was leaning over into the abyss a little too far myself. And so I was instructed to step back. And so I lay back down on my cot and somehow fell asleep. And in whatever interval happened afterwards, my cot collapsed, and I woke up, and my father had taken his last breath.
Wow. So do you find that sometimes the dying will wait until there's no one around
Ah,
before they cross?
that's a good question too. And that is a phenomena that does happen. You can be tending your loved ones so carefully and so wanting to be that helpful presence. And then you decide to go to the washroom or go get a coffee. And that's the moment that our loved one dies. So I've been able to assure people from my own experience that there's perhaps a plan in that it's hard to take that last step. And just as I was instructed to back off, perhaps there's some unconscious thing to let that person have their space to take that final step without so much that we're wanting to pull them back.
One phenomenon that I've witnessed and wanted to ask you about was when people don't believe in an afterlife and they have no spiritual belief system, um, do they struggle more at the time of death? Is there more fear present?
Well, that certainly was part of my role, is to find what a person did believe in. They might not have a traditional view of religion or have explored spirituality, but usually I could find, what is it that gives you strength? What is it that speaks to you? And often it might be nature, or it might be some poetry or artistic endeavor. And leaning into that could be a resource. So I think we all have resources that we've developed. If we can step into that and to help the person see what it is that has helped them through their life all this time, it opens it up. Now, I would have the question often, have you ever had an experience of a loved one after they've died? And even for those who haven't had a spiritual or religious belief, many of them will have said, oh, this strange thing happened, and would describe a phenomena that would have happened. So that told me that, people are experiencing, phenomena after a loved one has died, regardless of their belief system. And if that is true, then how can we lean into that and use that as our imagination, that there is more going on? We don't know exactly what, unless we're very clairvoyant or unless we have deep felt experiences and have crossed over enough to trust that. But we do have an imagination that we need to expand, because that is as real as this material world.
I'm glad you're talking about imagination, because one of the shamanic practices is helping the dead to cross, is teaching them how to go into a trance state or into the dream state. Is that dream state, the imagination, is that a bridge between the living and the dead?
Ah, beautiful. I think there's many levels of imagination, but ultimately it is all part of the ladder, the bridge. So not under, in our materialistic world, we kind of underestimate the power of our imagination and our visualizations and our senses, but they are all higher faculties that we can develop and trust and lean into. And that will help us trust that there is more going on and that we are not alone. And I think anybody who's had experiences of being close to the threshold will understand that universal message that we are not alone.
Well, let's go into near-death experience a little bit. Have you been familiar yourself or others that have had near-death experiences, and how does that relate to then getting ready to cross in your lifetime?
Well, it is a gift that we are getting to hear many stories of these near-death experiences. They're giving us some pictures and stories that will hopefully open up our imaginations and create some new pictures, because there is a commonality in many of them. Many of the stories each will have their own unique, unique take on it, because we're all individuals and come from different cultural references. But there is enough commonality that hopefully it will give us some more confidence once again to know and to be more conscious about making a bridge to that next life that we are all on.
Have you found that people that have had near-death experiences kind of lose their fear of death?
It certainly seems to be the common experience that one hears over and over again. So we're getting some tools. We're getting people who've had near-death experiences being able to tell us more. We're having people who've used psychedelics, and that has created a bridge. we're having people who are more clairvoyant and can cross over in a conscious way. And we're having people who, through their own depth of bodily felt sense, understand and are hearing that their loved ones are giving them the messages that there is more, that they are not alone. So we're getting the education is coming to us to give us the ladder to make it to that far shore. That's the title of my writing that seems best to communicate that we're just on a journey, and that far shore can be as far or as close as we make it.
And I love the fact that new stuff is coming through, and we're getting more information. Do you believe that we will have new traditions coming out of this time that better fit
Mm.
the people of today?
That's a really good hope. Um, we seem to be in this gap right now where um, we've had to, take a step away from some of the traditions that were becoming to feel not very meaningful or relevant. And so we've created some new ones. It's common to have a celebration of life now, which is a beautiful sound to it. But my only concern is that we don't bypass that initial part where the person has actually died and there's grief, and that there is an honoring of the death process. And then we can get to the celebration of life. But sometimes we miss that initial stage. And I have so many friends, who've experienced a loved one dying, and there isn't anything for a month or much longer. And there's, our psyche needs symbol, and it needs a way to commemorate. It's an ancient thing, and we
Well,
can't bypass that.
I'm sorry, it's time for us to take another station break that we can't bypass. Please stay with us as Nancy and I continue to explore dying, death, and beyond. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. Okay, so I'm dead. Now what? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Nancy MacMillan. Her website, nancymacmillan.substack.com. Nancy, there's, of course, as many different ways of dealing with the moment after death as there are people to do it and traditions to do it. But what's the commonality of what's the right steps to take once the person has just died?
Mhm,
What are the right steps to take? So,
mhm.
because people, we flounder, what do I do
Right,
now?
of course, yeah, and that's understandable. The most important thing that I suggest is death is not an emergency. So to slow down, and although our nervous systems might be very ramped up, but to take a moment and breathe and to be present and to sit, and not to immediately feel you have to call, the medical professionals to come in, but to let that moment expand, be present with it, and notice. That is how we become educated and present in a helpful presence to dying, death, and our own eventual death, is to create a space to where we can lean into it. And everybody I know that has been able to do that has been able to feel something happen at that time, and this will sound strange if one hasn't discovered this, but that it can be oddly beautiful.
It's like the gates open for a while. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, another thing that what we've learned from near-death experiences is oftentimes people are hovering over their body, looking down for quite some time before they're sucked into the tunnel and then kicked back out. Um, do you think it's the same with the dead? And is that also why it's really important to just kind of sit there and hold space for a while?
Oh, very good. Yes, and it just was an instinctual sense I had to do that with my mother. I was just following, and hopefully, if we are tuned into our own intuition and our own body sense, we will be able to trust and know when the right thing is to do at the right time. So for my mom, when she died, it felt like just a huge courtesy to allow her the time and space to be in that place before being rushed into the next thing, right? There's so many subtle processes that are beyond our knowing often what's happening at that edge. And the subtlety of that place is so sweet. And I didn't want to disturb that. So I let my mom remain in her bed at the nursing home for 8 hours before I felt the instinct to move to the next step. And I felt that that just allowed her the grace and the courtesy to settle into her new place. And then we had the funeral director come to move her body to my home, and then we took over the next steps. But all the way talking to her, helping her understand that she had just crossed over, that she had died, and, well done, beautiful. And to give her that encouragement, and that we would be taking care of her over the next few days, and that she could relax into it. And I could then track how her body changed over those 3 days, and that she became ready for that next journey that she took. For her, in her case, was cremation. For others, it might be burial or green burial. And by the third day, I placed my hands on her head, and the amount of energy pouring off of her head was extraordinary, which was just another example that excarnating is a process, and allowing and tending those immediacy afterwards is a gift for them and a gift for us to understand and be close to that liminal realm in such a profound way.
Have you been around people that are sensitive and actually see the spirit of the ancestors in the room when a loved one is getting ready to cross?
Hmm. Um, yes, I would say that I myself have had that felt sense of my grandmother being with my mother, and that was a beautiful feeling. And I could feel that my mother felt that too. She had kind of regressed into a younger state and calling out for her mother, and to feel the presence of my grandmother, whom I had never met because she died a long time ago, in the same room was a real gift, and that has stayed with me because I can feel her now presence with me in a visceral kind of way.
Um, so there's several different job descriptions that seem to steward the dead through the process. I take it that your job description is to help the dead and the family up to the point of death.
Mhm.
Okay. That a death doula then takes over to help with the preparation of the body and all of that stuff. Are you familiar with psychopump, the ones that take it from there to help the dead
Mhm.
to cross?
Right. I am, and I'm intrigued by that process. And I would say, um, by following friends and family, I've traced myself into that, but I'm not versed in it. But that is something that we've lost in our culture as well. And the value of having somebody trained that can help those next steps, and to observe them and then tell us. um, I can only imagine the value of that. And just to the death doula part, the death doula helps the family with it. They don't take over. They're just a guide in the process.
Right. I didn't mean they take over, but
Yeah,
that
just
their role
they have,
steps in at
right,
that point.
right, because they have
Yes.
to be
Yes.
careful about not taking on the role of the funeral director, because they're they're careful about that. But yes, the psychopomp is a fascinating role, and I look forward to hearing more about that. Maybe you have something to say about that.
Well, we're listening to you today, so
Okay. Yeah.
probably not beyond that
Okay.
question. Um, let's talk about ghosts, okay? Have you experienced people that are having trouble crossing, or people that just kind of got stuck here and they're spiritual beings, but still in this realm?
Right. Well, I'd say that's a phenomena that is more common than we know. And but how weak it shows up will be in feeling that's not quite right, about how things are going. And that's most of our society these days. So we can kind of safely assume that there are a lot of people who are probably a little lost, and and uh, how do they get their nourishment? Well, by perhaps becoming a little too close to those of us here that have holes or unfinished places that they can then attach to. This is my understanding of how it works, and I have had the felt sense of it. Um, so that's part of why I feel so committed to learning how to help our dead move on in a healthy, whole way, and to be present with the grieving process to make sure that clarity of transition happens. Because once they haven't, then you do need people who have special training and insight to know how to help them move on.
There's a couple of concepts, and they make sense to me, believe it or not. Is One of them is the Tibetan concept of the bardo, and how we have to kind of go through our life, kind of like have a life review
Mhm.
in order to step our frequency up enough to cross over. And then
Correct.
also the Catholic's view of purgatory. Is there, in your opinion, or what you've experienced, a process of moving backwards through our life's
Mhm.
trauma where we might have separated from ourselves, gathering ourselves enough to cross? And is that a sticking point for some?
Yes. Well, that's certainly what we've learned from people who've had the near-death experiences, that the common feature of that is that there is this life review where we can step back and have a panorama of what our life has been. And then the further we go out, then there is a more systematic life review where we do get to revisit the deeds of our lifetime, often from the perspective of the person who has been harmed or helped by them. So it's a very visceral feeling of, oh, this is what it's like. And that in that way we can learn and make reparations and prepare for another lifetime of meeting this encounter again. Now, in the case of being trapped and looking back at that life and reviewing it and making amends while you're in a purgatory state, uh, I don't know.
We'll know when we get there, right?
Yes.
We'll know when we get there.
But
Uh,
the thing is to trust that there is a process, a very clear process that most traditions understand. There is a map on the other side that we've lost track of. And so we look at other traditions to look at their map, and that might twig us to what instinctually in the root of our heritage is a psychic map that we can tap into as well.
Pretty amazing. So, um, the in the Celtic tradition, there's shamanic tradition. There's a concept called the three harpers. Okay,
Mm,
and they would play it at a funeral, and the first harper would play the grief and mourning.
mm.
Okay, and then the second harper would play joy and celebration of life. But the process wasn't done until the third harper played, and he would play a lullaby.
Ah,
Okay. So how does that fit in, or does it fit in with what you've experienced in the process?
yeah, that is just a beautiful picture. So grief, and then joy. That's the eternal paradox, isn't it? Grief and joy. And interesting that the joy comes out of the grief. It's not beside it, it's not before it, it's not instead of. It comes out of the grief. And anybody who's gone through the depths of grief in a full bodily way has experienced, I'm pretty sure, that luminescent thread of joy that is a surprise. Like, how would you have thought that would happen? Yeah. And then the lullaby, it's like, oh, soothing our souls and to come back to a place of perhaps innocence and starting over again.
Mm,
Mhm,
beautiful. Well, it's just about time to close, and I wouldn't be complete if I didn't ask you, Nancy, what's your
mhm.
mission?
Right. Well, it's to know that we can lean into death and that we can become more conscious. And in doing so, with our dying, with our death, and with our loved ones who have gone beyond, we can transform our lives and create some meaning from this world once again.
Do you feel that by understanding more deeply and accepting the death process, that it can enhance our life?
Absolutely. I think completing the circle between life and death and that which lies beyond creates a circle and makes life more possible to be enriched and nourished by both ends.
Well, very lovely. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Nancy, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Gwilda, for your interest and your dedication to all these topics.
Thank you. Our guest this hour has been Nancy MacMillan, the author of Call to the Far Shore, Carrying Our Loved Ones Through Dying, Death, and Beyond. To find out more about Nancy, where you can find her book and all she has to offer, visit her website, nancyjmcmillan.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy our past archived episodes, you can always visit www.missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join us again right here on the Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, vocbn.ca, where this mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.